So we're going to look at chapter 6. So you can find that on page 37. So we've skipped chapter 5, which we've done in the first semester. So please be mindful of that. So tendering. So now we've done our BOQ, we've measured all our quantities, and we've done all our specifications, and now we've compiled a tender document. So just remember, we only looked at the pricing details now, which comprises your BOQ, your drawings, your specifications usually. It does not include all of your tendering procedures and all of that administration part, which we're not going to delve into in this module, but just be aware of that, that there's a whole lot of other administration items that also forms part of a tender document. So tendering are tenders are either competitive or negotiated, so non-competitive. So that's the two basic sides of it. So you always try and get as competitive tenders as you can, because that drives down the cost of your project. If you only get one quote and the tenderers are aware of that, they can basically make their price. Yeah, because there's no competition. And then you get competitive tendering. So competitive tendering is used on most projects, mainly to obtain the best possible price. Where you won't have a competitive tendering is you will have a bit of a negotiation, but that's usually where you have specialist installations. Only 1 or 2 people can actually do this type of installations, and then or the client has worked with this contractor or tenderer before, and he would rather pay extra for having this contractor on the project. That's usually in the private sector that happens. Government projects are almost exclusively competitive tendering and open tenders as well. Okay, then it has an advantage over its rivals. There are risks for both contractor and client on these types of projects, and it's elaborated a little bit in your textbooks, and we'll get into that. Thus, to pre-select certain tenderers or not, that is the question. Okay, so you can still have a combination of negotiations, is where you maybe select free tenderers, where you think these free tenderers will give you a good quality, but you still make it open so that they actually have to compete against each other to get the job. Okay. Whenever doing these considerations to go competitive or negotiated tenders or tendering methods, you should keep in mind the time of tendering is normally limited, so you can't go out on an elaborate tender process, because usually developers want to either occupy the house because they don't have another place to stay, or they need to get occupants in a commercial building because they want to try and start generating income through that, etc. Time for site and progress planning is limited, and you only know what the subcontractors will be used after appointment of the contractor. So this is something that you need to be aware of when you use competitive tendering, because the contractor usually has his own set of subcontractors, and they usually go through a tender process as well, to get the best price, to make them more competitive. Okay, then you've got open tenders, which forms part of competitive tendering. So this is the first category that we're going to look at. The whole market is tested, and it's usually in the public sector, so it's advertised in a paper and so on, and anyone that qualifies can actually tender on it. It's advertised in the press and qualified by stating what the client that the client is not bound to accept the lowest tender or any of the tenders. Usually results in very keen tenders, so it has a risk. That's the risk that was spoken about in the previous slide, and perhaps too keen. Okay. The whole market, including the contractors, specialist subcontractors, and suppliers, are made aware. There's a lot of transparency in this process. Everyone knows that this tenders is going out, as you will see, is the construction industry is quite small, especially in a community like Bloemfontein or in the smaller communities. You will see that everyone usually is aware of what's going on, especially the suppliers. Okay, then clients may be tempted to choose the lowest tender. That is always a very difficult decision to make, and then careful evaluation of tenders are required. So it's not necessarily the cheapest one that will be the best. Then selected tenders. So selected tenders is usually used on by semi-state organizations, or if it's specialized also, like the mining industry. They know they've worked with these contractors before, so they would be able to finish the projects and so on. So contractors are shortlisted, and it basically follows the following steps. Tenders from a list of contractors are invited to tender. The experience are used as measures to select the capability, financial stability, previous experience, specific expertise, and quality. Most, if not all, the selected tenders can do the job. A limited number of tenders, and therefore you have a still competitive element on the tender process. Collusion may occur. Remember on the 2010 soccer stadiums, where there was only a few contractors that could actually build those types of stadiums, and there was collusion that actually took place. The client is obliged to accept the lowest tender because the contractors were already shortlisted. So in essence, all of these contractors can actually do the work. It can be done either by invitation or pre-qualification. Okay, so contractors can either be invited, or they have to be show the client that they can actually do this job or not. And then you've got negotiated tenders or continued. Sometimes it's more beneficial to negotiate when a competitive element in the market is low, when there isn't very much competition in the industry. Particular difficult construction requirements, specifications, and expertise is used. There's a bit of a negotiation between the client, QS, and contractors and so forth, because the only gatekeeper is really the client and the QS and the architect that really sees whether this is way out prices or not. Some types of contracts that you get is you've got package contracts or turnkey type of or managed from the contract. This is where usually where it's very specialized, and you have contracts where the contractor has to do the design and the installation. For instance, a project that we were involved in is the vernacular, or the it's like the cable car or the little tram that would go up a naval hill, for instance. A large portion of that is actually done and were designed by a supplier that can actually supply and install that type of installation. Whereas the other section, like the building section and the normal electrical and structural and all of that section of the project, was actually more towards was done in a conventional way. Okay, so the following is important factors to keep in mind whenever having negotiated tenders. Negotiations should be based upon as complete a set of documentation as possible through an expert who uses a BOQ. So on a vernacular, we had a BOQ, and then on this section for the vernacular itself, excluding the buildings and all of that, was actually a separate contract where we had just a prescriptive type of specifications that the contractor had to adhere to. During the process, the negotiations certain items should be established. Okay, if there's a markup on the project, so for instance, you might even specify that yes, you can if you've got this amount of cost, you can put on a 30 to 50% markup on top of that, so you basically cap it at a certain percentage of the actual cost. Attendance on work performed by selected subcontractors can also be prescribed. Detailed pricing, preliminary items, the breakdown of that can be asked for from the contractor or the tenderer. Detailed build-up of hourly rates for artisans, semi-skilled, unskilled laborers. Because you don't really know how much work there's going to be, you might want these rates so that if you get into implementation, you can actually measure the amount of hours they work on a project and then multiply it by the agreed rates that the contractor has provided. Okay, so in closing, a list of work to be performed by selected subcontractors is then given. Negotiated tenders usually favor contractors in the process because they have the bulk of the knowledge of how this project is actually supposed to be constructed. The amount being higher than other tender methods, that's a given. Negotiated contracts with pre-escalation reputable firms, pre-selected, firms. Okay, so here you would want someone that can actually do the work, who's maybe who's got a good reputation of being transparent, ethical, etc. Substantial shortening of contract periods can be used. Buildability is a buildability consequent. Okay, so the contractor is in the design team, so the buildability is quite good. Specialist time is wasted in the preparation of competitive tenders. Okay, usually not a problem if you have experienced professionals. Okay, then the tender process, how that usually works. Okay, e.g. open or selected is issued to so we're first going to look at the tender process and open and selected tenders. Issued the interested parties is recorded. The interest of the interested parties are recorded. Communication is key during this tender process. Simple clarification on documentation is issued. Any items discussed with one of the tenderers is discussed in this clarification meetings. Deviations from conditions or information relative to the tendering process are highlighted. Questions may arise through inquiries, suppliers, the professional team, and other parties. Okay, tender meeting, site visits. There's usually a formal site meeting for tenderers to explain to them what the project entails, and if there's any questions they can ask and clarify that. It is usually compulsory for open tenders. The scope of the project is explained. Ambiguities in the documentation, if any, is discussed and explained. Queries from the tenderers are discussed. Inspection of the site is usually conducted after the meeting to see what the position of the works is, position of the site establishment, service connections, soil conditions, pre-contract work, existing work, and if there's trees in which that should be protected, etc. Then you get to adjudication. So now basically you've had your tender briefing, you've issued your documentation, and now you receive back your tender document. So the evaluation of the tenders received, so evaluated in accordance to the criteria. So you've got specific criteria that you look at. Open in public, or at least in the presence of the tenderers. So it's all as transparent as possible. So usually you've got a big day, usually 12 o'clock on a Friday, somewhere in a client's office. All the tenderers that submitted can sit, and it's open there and then, and the prices is read out so that everyone knows what everyone tendered, to see whether they're in the ballpark or not with their tender rates or tender amount. And also if there's questions, for instance, if someone is appointed but was maybe the highest tenderer, then it usually raises flags. Or if that specific contractor is appointed but he has no experience, for instance, on building work, it might raise a flag because they might not meet the criteria according to the tender specifications. So it's an endeavor to be as transparent as possible. So you have a specific tender closing date. It's in full legal force of this of state period tender closing date. So for instance, if you're late by 5 minutes, you're late by 5 minutes. Your tender is not included, it's usually excluded. I've had that quite a few times where contractors were running down the pathway, but then the doors just closed in front of them. So it is quite brutal, but that's unfortunately the rules. It becomes a legal thing, and as soon as you make a amendment to those rules, it just makes you open for criticism. You can, however, talking about that time period and closing the doors just in front of it, in front of the contractors, you may ask all the tenderers in the meeting, do you have a problem if we open the doors for these tenderers that came late within a reasonable time? If they agree, yes, you can allow that, as long as there's a mutual buy-in from all of the tenderers, then it's accepted. Okay. Then the lowest or any tender will not necessarily be accepted. Mentioned that before. No fax, telephone or email tenders will be permitted. Should be open at the time and place indicated. Very important. The opened document should be announced in public. So the amount, who the contractor is, what his tender amount was, etc. Then that's all nice and well. So all of the data is recorded, and then the minutes is circulated. Okay, the price and quality evaluation of the tenders received. There's certain criteria that we look at. So you've got your price and qualifications that you might look at. You have with date and offer stamp. Is this the official document? Was all the pages signed, etc., etc. Interested parties, has everything been declared? No late tenders should be accepted. Marginally late, okay, here's that little thing that I spoke about earlier on. If there's buy-in from everyone, then it's usually accepted, although I don't like doing that because it just leads to more animosity, and so best to keep to the rules. It just makes life easier. It's a bit more harsh, but it just makes life easier. Be accepted with the consent of those present. Okay, that's what I spoke about. Are mandated to take such decisions. Okay, are you allowed to actually make such decisions? It's usually with the client. The client makes the rules. It depends on the client. If the client is also open for it, then you may make an amendment as as such. Was mailed in good time before the closing time. Okay, this is not that important, but usually nowadays you have open tenders where you can actually mail your tenders, so everything is done online, and so was it mailed in time, etc., etc., when was it received, and so forth. Okay, then who's the responsible person actually sitting in the tender process? and then you have an official from your client opening for the tenders, and then you would see whether the tender is a legitimate tender, as the form of offer and acceptance been signed by the tenderer or not. So there's a whole lot of legal aspects that you look at. Okay, then evaluation of tenders received. Okay, so it's usually signed in that the tenderer submitted his tender. It's signed by the tenderer and then by the client and then the consultants. Where two envelope system is followed, you usually use two envelopes, and I see the indent isn't very nice here, but this is actually underneath this, so I'll just correct it now when I go back to the slide. So you've got your technical proposal of valid tenders is opened. After the technical proposals has been evaluated, then only the second document is open. So the two envelope system is the contract or tenderers submits two documents. Only the one is open for the technical details. If the contractor meets all the requirements, then the second one with the price is actually opened and evaluated further. Okay, then contact should be informed. Okay, so whoever goes through to the second round is informed usually that they're going through to the second round. Then the financial proposals of unsuccessful technical proposals should be returned unopened. So if they fell out of the first round of evaluations, the still sealed envelope is sent back to the contractor. Tender submissions should be compared against the required list of returnable documents. Okay, so this is a bit of an administration thing. Is the valid tax certificate included? Is all the necessary papers, registration as a company, do they have the right documentation, for instance, for BE, for their CIDB grading? Have they worked on this type of projects or not? Within a reasonable period of time, finding which of these tenderers will be disregarded as non-responsive. Okay, so sometimes if there's small items outstanding, the contractors may be contacted to furnish these documentation. All of this is obviously to the discretion of the client. Okay, so evaluation of the tenders received continued. The responsive tenders is one that confirms to all the terms. So the term responsive is the one that goes forward. Non-responsive tenders should be rejected. If there's arithmetical errors, it should be rejected as well. Discrepancies, acceptance of the amounts and words taken. If there's a discrepancy, for instance, acceptance of the amount in words is taken as the governing principle. So for instance, if you wrote in a amount of 100,000 in numbers, and then in words you wrote 1 million rand, the 1 million rand will be your tender offer. Okay, the following is then checked. Your price BOQ. So now you've gone through all the technical eligibility type of checks. Now you get to the price BOQ. Now you start comparing apples with apples and the price. So misplacement of decimal points in the unit rates might happen quite often, and then that is usually checked. Omissions on completions. What happens is the estimator fills in the wrong amount, which makes a big difference, or in the amounts. So these types of errors are ironed out. So it depends on the client and how they want to go forward. Sometimes the contract is just rejected if they made mistakes like that. Other times they actually asked to correct their mistake. Then arithmetical errors results in incorrect multiplication and etc., or items omitted or so, you can either use your discretion and use the prescribed methods. We usually shown in your tender conditions how it's going to be evaluated. So you can either correct it in accordance to that prescriptions, or you can contact the contractor to amend it, or so on, but the bottom line of the tender amount stays the same. So you can have two systems. The one that I usually work with is your tender amount. You can amend your rates, but you have to amend it in such a way that your tender amount doesn't change. So we call it rate balancing that usually takes place. But just take note that there's a certain amount of error identification during the tender process, and all of this leads to a risk analysis of each tender. Okay. Then evaluation of tenders received. Conditions always in building contracts that the tender amount should be adjusted. Okay, this is what I was talking about. So these are the types of conditions. Consult the CIDB information practice note 2. So this is just a note for you in future reference. Unrealistic financial tenders, i.e. too high or too low, is identified. And for instance, if the contract, going back to the errors, say a contractor makes an error and it amounts to a 2,000 Rand difference in his final amount, that's not a high risk. Usually it depends on the size of the project. But if, for instance, he has a 20 million Rand error on his project, which does happen quite often, then obviously one do not want to appoint a contractor with that high risk, being either higher or lower. It really depends on. You should ask the question: will the contractor be able to do the work? Okay, so you may reject someone if they made a big error like that, and it actually poses a high risk to your client. Okay, unreasonable and therefore rejected. That's what I was talking about just now. In terms of the tender performance or preference, so now you've established what the final tender amounts are, and then you look at the tender preference. These days we use a 80-20 rule, where 20% of the BE level contributes to the final mark, and then 80% of the tender price contributes the rest of the tender adjudication mark. Okay, and then the tenders are ranked, and then the preferred contractor or tenderer is proposed to the client, and then the client makes the final decision on that. Then enterprise status of structures and tendering entities. Please have a look at that in your book. And then eligibility of such preferences is also evaluated. So finally, you should look at whether contractors should be rejected or led through to the following round of evaluations. And then finally, evaluation of the tenders received. Okay, so now you've evaluated the tenders, then you propose who the contractor should be to your client, and then the client actually contacts the winning contractor and makes sure whether he's happy with his final offer. So he gives a financial offer. The lowest tender will be considered for the most favorable. Tenders involved awarding points. Okay, this is the preference points that I was talking about, the 80-20 rule. Then the financial offer, quality, functionality and preference is used. And then state departments and parastatals usually use these type of preferential points. However, whatever method may be used, it must be fully described in the tender data. Okay, so it was a mouthful. What I suggest is that you go through pages 37 up to 42. This is 5 pages that you have to read through, and it actually describes everything very well within this section. So please go through that. If there's any questions, you can contact me. So there was a bit of a mouthful of how the tender process actually works, but yeah, feel free to contact me if you have any questions on this. Thanks everyone, keep well.